Imagine waking up tomorrow and your savings are illegal. Not frozen, not taxed. Illegal. That's not a hypothetical. That's Tuesday, April 6th, 1933. And the most terrifying part, the government didn't need your permission. They didn't need a trial. They needed one signature, and they had it. But here's what history books quietly skip over. Most Americans never gave up a single ounce. So before you decide whether it can happen again, you need to understand what actually happened the first time. Because the real story of Executive Order 6102 isn't about gold. It's about power, panic, and how far a government will go when its back is against the wall. The year is 1933. America is drowning. Unemployment has hit 25%. Banks are collapsing like dominoes. Families are lining up not for food, but to pull their savings before the doors close forever. The Great Depression isn't a headline anymore. It's a neighbor. It's a father. It's an empty dinner table. Franklin D. Roosevelt steps into the Oval Office in March of that year. 32 days later, he signs an order that would have seemed unthinkable in any other era. He makes gold ownership a federal crime. Not for corporations, not for foreign nations, for you. For the person on the street carrying a $20 gold coin, the same coin that had been legal tender your entire life and your father's entire life before that. The official price? $20.67 per ounce. Hand it in, take your paper dollars, be grateful. The threat? $10,000 in fines, 10 years behind bars. And the clock? 26 days. But ask yourself, why the urgency? Why 26 days? Why not 6 months? Why not a legal process with courts and hearings? Because urgency is how you prevent people from thinking. And what they didn't want people thinking about was about to change everything. Here's the number they never put in the history books: 78%. That's the estimated percentage of privately held gold that was never surrendered. Let that sink in. The most powerful government on earth, backed by federal law, armed with criminal penalties, issued a nationwide confiscation order, and nearly 4 out of 5 ounces of private gold simply disappeared. How? Because enforcement was nearly impossible. The Federal Reserve and Treasury had no inventory of who owned what. There was no gold registry, no tracking system, no national database of coin collectors, jewelry owners, or private hoarders. They were fishing in the dark with a fine-toothed net, and most of the fish swam right through it. Prosecutions under Executive Order 6102 were extraordinarily rare. In fact, historians have documented fewer than a dozen serious federal cases in the years following the order. Most Americans simply stayed quiet, kept their gold, and waited. The government knew this, which raises an uncomfortable question. If enforcement was so weak, why issue the order at all? Here's where the story gets darker. The real target wasn't your grandfather's coin collection, it was the gold standard itself. Roosevelt's team needed to devalue the dollar to inject liquidity into a dying economy. But you can't devalue the dollar while citizens can legally demand gold in exchange for it. The confiscation wasn't about collecting gold, it was about breaking the psychological contract between Americans and sound money. And it worked. By January 1934, less than a year later, the government revalued gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. Overnight, the Treasury made a 69% profit on every ounce it had collected. The citizens who complied? They were legally robbed in broad daylight and handed a certificate to prove it. The ones who didn't comply? They quietly kept wealth that would multiply for decades. So the real lesson of 1933 isn't that the government took your gold, it's that the government tried, and most people who understood what was happening refused. Now ask yourself, what happens when a government with today's tools tries the same thing? In 1933, the government was essentially working blind. Today, they can see everything. Think about what's changed. Every gold ETF transaction is logged. Every wire transfer over $10,000 is reported. Every bullion dealer in the United States is required by law to file paperwork on certain purchases. The IRS treats gold as a collectible, taxable, trackable, traceable. The infrastructure for a modern confiscation already exists. It's just not called confiscation. Not yet. But here's where serious economists and historians start to get very quiet and very serious, because the conditions that triggered 1933 are not as distant as you'd like to believe. Currency crises, sovereign debt spirals, loss of confidence in paper money, central banks buying gold at record levels. These aren't ancient history. These are this decade. In 2024 alone, central banks globally purchased over 1,000 tons of gold for the third consecutive year. Why would the institutions that print money be hoarding the one asset that exists outside that system? Because they know something the headlines won't tell you. And there's a legal framework already in place that most Americans have never heard of, sitting quietly in federal law, rarely discussed, never repealed. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934 was never fully dismantled. The Trading with the Enemy Act, the legal backbone of Roosevelt's original order, was amended but never abolished. A president today could theoretically invoke emergency economic powers under existing law with terrifying speed. Could they actually enforce it this time? That depends on one factor that didn't exist in 1933. One factor that changes everything. Digital money. Here's the scenario no one wants to say out loud. A financial crisis hits. The dollar is in free fall. Gold spikes to $10,000 an ounce. And Congress passes an Emergency Economic Stabilization Act in 72 hours. Sound like fiction? In 2008, TARP passed in days. In 2020, $2 trillion moved in weeks. Speed is no longer a limitation for government action. It's a feature. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, are no longer theoretical. Over 130 countries are actively developing or piloting them. China's digital yuan is already in use. The European Central Bank is deep in its digital euro project. The United States Federal Reserve published its own CBDC research paper. Here's why this matters for gold owners specifically. A CBDC gives a government programmable money. They can restrict what you buy, when you spend, and, critically, they can make holding alternative stores of value like gold functionally impossible by cutting off your access to the financial system entirely. You wouldn't need a $10,000 fine. You'd just need a toggle switch. No digital wallet access, no ability to convert, no way to spend, no way to survive in a cashless economy. Compliance becomes the only rational option, not because of fear of prison, but fear of being economically erased. But there's a counterargument, and it's powerful. Gold ownership today is global in a way it never was in 1933. Americans couldn't easily move assets across borders in the Depression era. Today, gold can be held in vaults in Singapore, Switzerland, or the UAE, outside U.S. jurisdiction entirely. Crypto has introduced parallel financial rails. Decentralized systems exist precisely as a hedge against this scenario. The people who understand history aren't panicking, they're positioning. Because there's one final piece of this story that almost nobody talks about. One group that was exempt from the 1933 order. One loophole that Roosevelt left open. And whether that loophole still exists today may be the most important thing you hear in this entire video. Roosevelt exempted one category of gold from his confiscation order: collector's coins, rare coins, gold with recognized special value to collectors. Intentional? Almost certainly. A gift to the well-connected? Possibly. But what it created was a legal escape hatch, and it's still referenced in discussions of gold law to this day. Here's what the evidence actually tells us. Could a government confiscate gold again? Legally, the framework exists. Practically, enforcement would be orders of magnitude more complex than 1933, but also orders of magnitude better equipped. Technologically, a cashless, CBDC integrated financial system could make voluntary compliance the only viable option without a single arrest. But here's the deeper truth. Governments don't confiscate gold when it's inconvenient. They confiscate gold when they're desperate. And desperation at a national scale only arrives when the system is already breaking down. Which means if confiscation is on the table, the crisis that triggers it is the real threat, The confiscation is just the symptom. This is exactly why the world's most sophisticated investors, from Ray Dalio to central banks in China, Russia, India, and Poland, have been accumulating physical gold at historic rates. Not because they're paranoid, because they've read the same history you just did. In 1933, the people who trusted the system turned in their gold for paper promises. The dollar they received was devalued within a year. The gold they surrendered was repriced 69% higher, profit flowing directly to the government that took it. The people who understood the system kept their gold quiet, kept their heads down, and emerged from the Depression with real wealth intact. Nearly a century later, the question isn't really can they do it again? The question is, which person are you going to be? The one who finds out when it's too late, or the one who already knows? Gold has survived every empire that tried to replace it, every currency that tried to outlast it, every government that tried to control it. It was here before 1933. It'll be here after whatever comes next. The only variable is whether you are holding it when that moment arrives. If this made you think differently about the money in your hands, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The information is free. The decision is yours.